Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. Today I'm joined by Nick Wigdahl for a conversation around how to manage molecule uncertainty and what that means to scaling up pharma companies, portfolio optimization and risk management. Nick has spent his career at the intersection of big pharma operations and more entrepreneurial thinking, from supply chain leadership at Roche and GSK to working with founder-led businesses. Today, he's Director of PharmaGro, helping mid-sized CDMOs and life science companies get smarter about how they manage their molecule portfolios. Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Really looking forward to it.
Great to have you here. You've had quite an unusual career path, I'd say, from your big pharma supply chain roles, family offices, entrepreneur-led businesses. Be interesting to get a quick overview of how you got here, and I think how does sitting across those two worlds shape how you think about the industry?
I arrived here through a combination of having worked for a couple of family offices, which sort of where I was working on the investment side and the portfolio management side. And that I really enjoyed. And they were, interestingly enough, quite low-tech businesses compared to pharma. They were more to do with logistics and transportation. I then was pivoted towards to pharmaceuticals, partly because I'd always had a strong interest in technology. I did an MBA at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm not a technologist myself, but I've always enjoyed working with scientists and people who are leading in technology. So those two came together, and when I was at Roche, particularly, it gave me the opportunity to work certainly with fantastic technologists, but also to exercise the portfolio management capabilities.
Thank you. Let's talk about molecule uncertainty, what it is, and why is it a challenge? Could you break that down a bit for us, please?
Sure. So the way to think about it is molecule uncertainty. There are two elements. One is the commercial uncertainty, and one is the scientific or the technical uncertainty. The technical uncertainty stems from the fact that we never know whether a molecule will succeed or not at each of the different phases. And it is a well-known sort of point of reference in the industry that you've got about a 10% chance of getting all the way from development through or preclinical through to a commercial product. And the way to think about that then is you need to manage that at each of the distinct phases. And by understanding what the potential risk is, it then helps you make better decisions around either investment or in putting your resource behind business development.
That 10% is extremely low and high risk. How does that typically change as you work your way through the different phases? So if the 10% is at an early discovery phase, say, how generally does it move down the pipeline?
I'll come back to the pre-development stage because that's possibly the most risky. But if you go through the clinical stages 1, 2, and 3, typically, actually, it's phase 2 that tends to be the most risky. So you've got somewhere around something like about a 60% chance in phase 1 that goes down in phase 2, and then by the time you get to phase 3, you are then at probably a higher percentage, more like around 70%. So if you add those three together, then you get this number of around 10%. The one that is difficult to know about is the pre-development. And the reason for that is that there is much less data published by the pharma companies. Once you're into the development phases, then there's a lot more spotlighting. And also because of the FDA process, you do need to be much more transparent. The preclinical is much harder to estimate.
How is it possible to benchmark this sort of historical phase transition data?
Sure. The answer to that has changed, and needless to say, AI has played a role. Traditionally, there were studies being done mainly by academic institutions. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology did a very good one towards the end of just before 2020, and that has been quite a benchmark study. But there have been academic studies before and after then, and that was basically the main way of doing it. And it was also quite laborious because it meant getting a number of PhD students or analysts to trawl through all the FDA records. What's happening now with AI and bigger data is that it's possible to analyze a far greater set of data and quicker. And probably the effect that this has had is that it means that you can now start to be a bit more, you can go into different areas. So an example would be antibody drug conjugates, where there's obviously a lot of interest at the moment. And the data for that is now you can start to formulate risk profiles much quicker than you would have been able to do, say, even 5 years ago.
So it's possible then to break it down by different modalities. When you're trying to do a benchmarking exercise like this, how would you advise people look at it to get the most reliable, robust
Sure.
view?
There are a couple of variables. So one is the therapeutic category. So there are some therapeutic categories that tend to be more risky or more difficult to solve than others.
Mhm.
Oncology and central nervous system are two of the more risky, particularly the efforts to solve Alzheimer's and brain disease. And there have been some spectacular failures in that area. So those tend to be more risky, whereas something like cardiology is more in the middle, if you like. Vaccines actually are less risky, partly because they've got such a faster development rate.
Why is that, Nick? Taking the example of Alzheimer's and oncology, why are they so hard to forecast?
The mode of action is sometimes less clear, and also the trials tend to be much longer, and so it's more difficult to get the results that to be sure that of the actual results. So it's the length and the modality, and also just the biology, if you like, is more tricky in those areas,
Mhm.
particularly the brain-blood barrier as relates to CNS.
So it is possible then to look at target profiles which are similar to get to a more robust, reliable estimate on success.
That's right. I think one of the other interesting things is that there is an interplay between, if you like, the commercial risk and the scientific risk. So
Hmm.
it's sometimes easy to think that molecules fail just because of the science. But actually, often it's the fact that some of the startup companies are not as well funded, in which case they can't necessarily always see through a whole clinical trial, even though the molecule may, have more promise than others. So there is an interplay between financial strength or
Okay.
commercial risk and the scientific risk.
Interesting. If you're reviewing the commercial risk, what kind of factors, what kind of variables would be included in that assessment?
Two commercial risks is one is in general, it's less risky to deal with existing customers. And so typically the rollover rate for an existing customer may be in the range of somewhere around, say, 80%. I mean, there'll be some customers who have, or some CDMOs who have higher numbers. Whereas if you're bidding on a new piece of work, then with a new customer, then your chance of success is much lower, maybe 25% or so.
Hmm.
So that's one area to look at. The second area is, as we've said, is around the financial strength of the company. I suppose to give an example is some CDMOs like to try and get in early. They like to be at the pre-development or preclinical phase, which makes a lot of sense because then you can follow the molecule through. But the commercial risk tends to be very high at that stage. So if you have a portfolio just of early stage startups, particularly ones, for example, with only a single molecule in their portfolio, that is at the high end of the risk factor. And
Hmm.
therefore, you need a lot of those in order to spread your risk.
Okay, thank you. Be interesting to get some use cases for this sort of review. I guess for the biotechs themselves, perhaps pharma companies looking at acquisitions, investors, CDMOs. What are the most common types of use cases which you're experiencing?
So I think there are a couple of ones. One is that the CDMO industry is highly backed by private equity, to a degree more so this than a number of other industries. And so the private equity input are very interested in how will the portfolio develop, particularly over like a 5 year time span, which
Hmm.
tends to be how long they'll hold an investment for. So then at that stage, they'll be looking at what's the balance between later stage molecules and earlier stage molecules, and have they got will the revenue generation be sufficient to meet their financial demands? That in itself is not, I mean, even the big pharma companies will do that sort of exercise. It's always a balance between your early stage and your late stage, but particularly with private equity backed businesses where they've got to service the debt cash flow, then or the debt flow, then it's an important factor.
Hmm. If you were advising a mid-size CDMO, say, what kind of advice could you share about how to evaluate and manage the portfolio? I guess both of current projects and those which the business development team are working on. Are there some best practices around that?
I think so. One piece of advice is to really understand what are you good at as a CDMO.
Hmm.
All CDMOs love to say that, we're flexible, we're here for the long term, we can accommodate the customer's wishes. But you actually really need to go one level below that. So what is it that you are better at than other companies? And that will then play to your strength. And then secondly, is to try and get that balance between early stage and late stage, and to ensure that you don't have too many eggs in one basket.
Hmm.
One of the things that we often see is you may have a customer which is a big pharma company with a lot of your revenue, which sounds very safe because big pharma is very safe
Hmm.
until it gets taken over by an even bigger pharma company. And then all of a sudden, that revenue stream can be put at risk because the other pharma company says, no, we want to do a tech transfer away to some of our existing CDMOs, or we want to sell the product or whatever. So that's always a risk. So although it's
Mm.
easy to think that the risk is always with the smaller, earlier stage molecules, you can see risk in the later stage as well.
There's a lot of data around, isn't there? So there's constant pipeline announcements, regulatory decisions, capacity updates. From the point of view of a CDMO, how would you separate the signal from noise for that so you have better market intelligence?
It's a very good question. And I think it's one that almost gets harder because the if you look at the landscape of companies who can supply data, it has mushroomed. So it has gone from
Mm.
a landscape where there were the traditional big players like IQVIA, etc., to any number of startups who can now provide so much data around how a molecule might develop. I think sometimes it's worth putting yourself in the shoes of, I suppose one of the advantages of having worked for a big pharma company is that
Mm.
as you go higher and higher into the decision making, actually the amount of data you need is almost less. You want less, but you really need to understand what are the three or four key factors that will make you that will make you invest in a molecule or undertake a tech transfer or whatever. And so it's being able to share more and more data doesn't necessarily lead to better decisions.
Mm.
So it comes to understanding what are the sort of two or three really key factors to focus in on.
And presumably, this is with a forward view of what the landscape's going to look like 3, 5 years out.
Yes, I think one of the hardest parts is to focus not on the landscape today, but when your molecule comes to fruition, what are the other three or four molecules that are been coming to fruition at the same time, and what is the chance of those actually making it there? And
Mm.
so, I mean, they always say a good chess player can think one or two moves ahead, whereas a great chess player can think, four or five moves ahead. And really, you need to be trying to do that four or five moves ahead thinking.
And to be thinking about the closest competitors which are also in the pipeline and what stage they'll be at.
Yes, up to a point. So obviously you need to think about what are the other, for example, if it's an oncology monoclonal antibody, there'll probably be three or four other competitors.
Hmm.
But sometimes there can be completely left field ways of solving a problem, which you also need to keep an eye on. And I suppose you possibly think the GLP-1 is an example in the sense that if you had been in, Weight Watchers a while ago, or if you'd been looking at the anti-obesity market, you would have been looking at a whole load of things other than GLP-1s, and then
Mm.
they suddenly came from the left field. Obviously, this is difficult to do, but you need to be able to think what could be an alternative way of solving this problem that is outside the medically or the generally accepted field.
Okay, that's sort of benchmarking against how would you benchmark against competitive CDMOs, for example, and the types of capacity which they'll have now and in the future? Is that possible to also forecast?
Yes, I think the use of large data certainly helps in terms of just looking at capacity announcements. But
Hmm.
I think one of the key points, so there are two things, is one is having the capacity, and two is can they really, really use it? And by that I mean is it takes time to not merely commission a plant, but actually to really get experience in using it. And so it's a question of the capacity and the experience of the CDMO behind that. And I
Hmm.
think quite a good example is medical devices, where if you look at a medical device, is there's obviously quite a lot of, I mean, at the moment, probably about 50% of products coming down the pipelines have some sort of device connected with them, and the devices are getting more complicated. But actually, to train up people to actually assemble medical devices and to absolutely use them, to produce them without fault, it takes a lot longer than merely just opening a new plant. And so it's a
Hmm.
combination of capacity and capability.
Thinking about uncertainty, one of the big areas at the moment, obviously, is in terms of geopolitics, is around that reshoring drive to the US. With your crystal ball, Nick, how would you see that playing out in terms of talent, capacity? Is there going to be enough to manage to reshore everything that's currently expected to be reshored back to the US?
I think that any shortages won't necessarily be in the areas, for example, of capital. No. I think some of the shortages may be in slightly more unusual areas, like have we got enough skilled workforce to train? And also, actually, have we got enough construction people to actually build the factories? When I was working at Roche, one of the things that we were coming up against was a shortage of things like electricians, good mechanics, people to actually run the plants. And this is not merely Roche, talking with other pharma companies. So it's often those sorts of areas there where you can see a shortage, and also analytical capability. That's often as much a bottleneck as the sheer capacity.
I mean, it is such an uncertain world at the moment, daily change, which is happening. As a final question, Nick, I wonder if you could just share any thoughts, any reflections about how people can be better at longer term forecasting, can be better at thinking five chess moves ahead. How do you not get distracted by the day to day and actually create the type of long term robust plans that pharma needs?
In terms of the long term thinking, it's often worth trying to think about alternative scenarios and to try and be consistent. And let me give you an example of that. Um, so, how do you think if we cast our mind back about a year to the Donald Trump announcement of tariffs, there was quite a lot of thinking in the industry that this is going to be disastrous. And I think it's worth thinking of, okay, let's have a scenario where actually it works. Okay. So let's have
Mhm.
two scenarios. One is a scenario where the tariffs are enacted, factories are rebuilt in the US, there isn't a brain drain. And I think you have to say that the brain drain threat probably was overdone. I mean, the sheer depth of American science is incredible. Um, but even if you are a believer that it could happen, you still want to have a scenario where the Trump world works. And interestingly enough, a year on from the Trump tariffs, US economic growth has not been affected as much as most economists thought. So, if you like, sort of, America stays great as a scenario, would be one scenario. The second scenario, which you might call New World Order, says, okay, so let's really push the button on all the other things that are happening. So China becomes a leading source of origination. There is a brain drain from the US. The regionalization of CDMOs really does take place, which then leads to a loss of economies of scale. And finally, you also have a resurgence of the EU. Now,
Hmm.
Do either of those, if you like, and I should say the other one that's worth thinking about is, let's say that Trump was serious about price cuts and that they were cut by 50%. So I think it's worth thinking through two very different scenarios. It's unlikely that either will happen in a pure form, but it then does allow you to act as you see signals coming through that one or the other scenarios is more likely to play out. And I do think that pharma pricing is a really good example, which for such a long time people say, yeah, but pharma's different and it's not really going to happen here. I'm sorry, if you look at the price of pharma in the US compared to anywhere else, it's not merely the fact that it's 3 to 4 times more. It's that almost any other industry does not have that same price gap. If you look at automobiles, even the most expensive countries in the world, say Singapore, the price gap is about 50, maybe twice as much, and that's for a tiny country. So if you just step back for a minute, the price issue in the US was so glaringly strange from an economic point of view. You should be thinking through the consequences of what happens if Trump was serious. So scenario planning, very useful tool.
Excellent. Nick, this has been fascinating speaking to you today. If people want to get in touch with you to talk about their portfolio risk management, what's the best way to do that?
We are www.pharmagro.co.uk. That's PHARMAGRO. Or you can email me on nick@pharmagro.co.uk. And we always love to start with a conversation about your business. What is it that makes your business really work? And where are some of the challenges? After that, we can take it from there.
Brilliant. Nick, thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you in person at CDMO Live Europe.
Absolutely looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Luke.